like to thank Honorable Pwajok as well as the Leader of the House for bringing before us this very important piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, sir, the need for this law, in spite of what the concerns that have been raised by Honorable Pwajok are, cannot be overemphasized. The jury is out, Mr. Speaker. There's a consensus that the bane of our very existence as a country lies solely at the foot of corruption. Mr. Speaker, also, in other climes, and I react to my brother, Honorable Mine, where he said that the bill that was brought up by the executive speaks to other things. In other climes, Mr. Speaker, sir, this bill is called the Anti-Money Laundering Bill and the Counter-Terrorism Financing Bill. And that's the reason I believe that that is in the body of the executive bill. But, Mr. Speaker, let me say that this bill, and of course the minority leader as well, pointed out to the fact that this bill has international dimensions. And indeed it does. But, Mr. Speaker, I shall try to draw the history of this bill. In 1995, Decree 3 was signed into law by this country, and it was the Anti-Money Laundering Act. But that law, Mr. Speaker, sir, was only with regards to drugs, with proceeds from drugs. Mr. Speaker, sir, Nigeria was the first country in Africa to have signed that kind of money laundering bill. Nigeria was the first country in Africa to have formed the EFCC. Nigeria was the first country in Africa to have formed the FIU. Nigeria led the charge with ECOWAS countries to form the Regional Anti-Money Laundering Act. Unfortunately, and it's called GIABA, which is an anti-money laundering arrangement that ensures that in the region that Nigeria leads the way against anti-money laundering. But, Mr. Speaker, it became even more pertinent for us as a country to trace this bill because, Mr. Speaker, there is also the belief that terrorism financing is a proceed of money laundering. And so, Mr. Speaker, the belief that as a country that has fought the scourge of terrorism as well, Mr. Speaker, this bill is very important to us as a country. But let me say that in spite of all the firsts that Nigeria has recorded with regard to this anti-money laundering, Nigeria is still one of the few countries around the world that have been blacklisted by the Financial Institution on Tracking Anti-Money Laundering, the FATF, because, Mr. Speaker, their claim is that we don't have strong legislations that criminalize anti-money laundering in the ways that they want it. They believe we do not have an architecture that is strong enough to deal with this anti-money laundering. And so when, of course, they also say to us that there are certain pieces of legislation that must work hand in hand with the anti-money laundering bill, the mutual assistance in criminal matters, the asset forfeiture bills. And they say that if we have not done that, then we cannot necessarily say that as a country that we're committed to the fight against corruption. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, as we have brought this law, in spite of what the little ifs, buts, or maybes may be, Mr. Speaker, I think it's imperative that as a House that shows commitment to fighting corruption, that this House realizes that time is of the essence. Nigeria's GDP, the size of the Nigerian economy, the population of Nigeria, the engagements between Nigerian financial institutions and financial institutions abroad are so tight that we must, as a country, show the commitment to passing these anti-money laundering laws. Mr. Speaker, let me also say that, of course, we are called the giants of Africa. But, Mr. Speaker, for us as well, and this is speaking purely from a foreign policy point of view, that if indeed Nigeria wants to lead in the Committee of Nations, and I have quoted copiously from Mr. President's inaugural speech where he said that Nigeria will be willing to act in any leadership capacity that she finds herself. Mr. Speaker, truth be told, in the African region, South Africa has been accepted into the global FATF, which is, of course, the financial institution that ties in all these money launderers and can track funds. Egypt is well on its way to doing that. Nigeria has been rejected once. Our review is coming up again. And, Mr. Speaker, sir, acceptability or lack of is predicated on the strength of the legislation and the commitment of government to indeed fighting corruption. And as Honorable Toby said, that there's a difference between fighting corrupt people and creating a platform, an architecture that creates an enabling environment for us to actually say that it is not only about echo, but it's about commitment. And therefore, it is based on this premise, Mr. Speaker, that I ask my colleagues that in spite of what the concerns are about the powers of the Attorney General, the situating of the FIU institution, whether it's with the EFCC, whether they want to create another institution, which of course I have my reservations about that we let it go to the public hearing. We conduct a public hearing, listen to the public, understand that, so that at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, sir, when our review comes up in the not too distant future, that Nigeria will be very well positioned for us to actually join the Committee of Nations in a way that gives us the fillip that we require as we seek to attract foreign direct investment and so on and so forth. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope that my colleagues will look very favorably to this piece of legislation and pass it so that it can go on to the public hearings I so submit. Thank you very much.
Honourable colleague, the caution is that the bill be now read the second